Good day. I'll be mostly speaking about the people with ASD because that's my speciality. I'm doing it from 1996. I have several adolescents and children with other disabilities, but my particular speciality is people with ASD. I'll be telling you just about things that, in my opinion, are practical from the point of view when you're organizing, socializing people through museum and cultural events. In my opinion, it's one of the areas where it's possible and needed to include these people in society, because this is one of the rare spheres that does not really put any specific requirements to academic background. There are specific requirements for your behavior, your social capabilities, but when it comes to your academic skills, it's much easier here. This is the area where we can include people with ASDs. Well, I would tell you about a huge spectrum. What does that include? In Russia, unfortunately, it's a vague line. The spectrum has vague borders, and people with autism, there's such a rule. They say if you know one person with autism, it means that you know only one person with autism. They are all different. This is a different level of understanding, speech capacities, people who do not really understand speech at all, and people have a very good level of academically correct, full-fledged literary speech, but with their particularities of understanding nevertheless. So that's a different level of understanding the information. There's a different behavioral difficulties and sensory understanding difficulties. But given all that, there are comprehensive peculiarities that are applicable to all the spectrum. They can be more or less vivid, but we can find them in pretty much most of the kids and most of adults. When we teach those people, when we divide these peculiarities into two categories, the bigger area of peculiarities that we can denigrate through changing the environment in which these kids will be, and there's a very small area of these particularities of the syndrome that we can't really do anything, and this comes to a difference in perception, the things that we'll just have to deal with as they are. The first thing that you can come across is the peculiarity when it comes to the planning of your own time and the perception of that time. For people who come, for instance, to a museum, the time continuum is impeded. People don't really understand how long. You cannot really understand how long will the excursion take. There's a fear for an unknown space. They don't know what happens in this place. They never visited this place. There are different sounds, different smells, a different space. There are difficulties with imagination, with understanding of what this place bears with it, and frequently a misunderstanding of a goal, of an objective, why we come to this place, what this place brings us, and what we're going to do in this place. What can we do to deal with that? We can probably engage in some preliminary training beforehand, a route, how long we'll be on that route, what kind of route that will be, what will happen in the end. We can plan an excursion for a smaller period of time than that is normal for other groups of school children. Then we can somehow mark the transition points, signals that we have stopped being in these place and have transited to the other one. what comes to the preparation work, the preliminary work, there's a lot of social stories and methodology that works quite well with people with autism, with people who quite well understand the speech and images. The social history can be done in whatever form. For instance, on the website of your museum, the excursion that you are offering to children, you have such a social history planned that will be so that the person accompanying these children can use it beforehand in order to prepare them and to explain where we're going, what we're going to do, what are the behavioral rules in that place, the route. This is a photo from that particular place. These places we have here for an excursion, and it was already adapted for people with children with autism. And there was a plan that you would follow, and you can mark during this route and see how time is flowing and when these event that was organized will finish. So this is a very a difficult moment. In order to understand these things in a museum, you have to have a training to that. You have to learn it. A smaller period of time. You can't really listen for a lot of time. There is an overload, a speech overload, a sensory overload that you dedicate to the event. It can be a bell, or it can be a card that you put forward that marks that now you should pay attention and switch your attention from this place to the other place in order to mark the transition. What else you can face and what frequently threatens and poses questions? This is the static positioning of the body. It's very hard to stand still. There is a need to move permanently. There are kids that cannot really stand, that will walk around, those who jump, those who would lean to the sides, and first of all, it poses a lot of questions because it doesn't really look like what we're used to. But for that purpose, we can also deal with that. We can adapt people to that and adapt ourselves. That you can always listen seated. Always a possibility to find a point of leaning that you can lean on, a holding point, some kind of a piece of furniture that or something that a person could lean on or hold. It can be a line that marks where a person should stand in order to listen, to see the objects that have been described. These are usual pictures from the internet. I'm not putting photos that we were faced with on purpose, but these is something characteristic to other school children with hyperactivity, where they can't really stand. So you can fix them at a certain line that marks the place where one should be. It's very hard not to touch something with your hands. You know, it's one of the rules of many museums, and it's a reasonable rule, because many of the things cannot be touched with your hands. But in the beginning, there is an understanding of social rules and regulations. They do not come up by themselves because it's ancient, or it's precious, or it's expensive. It can break. You have to teach these things. That's why a certain reminders has to be introduced. It does not come by itself. There is a need to occupy hands with something, because body does certain moves at the time. So with that hands, you have to do something. So many expressions come through hands. It's very hard just to see with your eyes simply without touching. What you can do, there's a thematic fragment definition. When you showing the amphoras, for instance, you can give a hand a small piece of ceramics so that a person can touch it and understand, and also get the sense of touch, a small particle of what are you talking about. The visual rules help a lot. Some kind of a stop line, a red line, visual rules, when you don't really have to remind every time that this is not to be touched, but some kind of a sign that you can pay people's attention to without breaking the time of your excursion. You can just point to that, and when you have some sort of marking a line that should not be crossed. What most of the people with ASD have, it's the understanding of rules that are introduced beforehand and that are visualized. They understand it through the notion of regulations. Not you told this, but there is a rule and that is how it is. It is written, it does not depend on you. It's easier to understand and easier to explain. The self-stimulation is something you can see in the most people. This is a particularity that we cannot really do anything with it. It's just a special thing of your organism. That's something that inherent to some of us, but we have a better control. We can control ourselves, and we cannot express it in the places where someone watches us. But with ASD people, the control is weaker. So what we should remember that adults who are accompanying them, they're working on that. If it's there in this place, but unfortunately, this is not that can be taken away. This is the requirement of a body. We can just be patient to it and stop paying attention to that, because shaking hands or shaking your body is something that is required by the body, or to spin something in your arms, vocal stimulation, some kind of vocal remarks. People would come with the chewers, they would chew their chewers, and you have to treat it with tolerance. Unfortunately, nothing can be done with it at that moment. As another particularity is the presence of a visual perception and visual thinking. It's very hard to grab something from that flow of thoughts. When we teach people to work with autism, we tell them that is their perception, and then you start teaching them. They hear three first words, and then there is a speech flow for them, which they very hard to grab something from. They are thinking with images or so-called cartoons, and that is something that an easier way to deliver information. You can deal with people who would not understand speech at all, who would rely only on visual images, on gestures, on some kind of pictograms. And at the same time, there will be people who would read very well, because science is the zone of interest of the majority of people with ASD, and many people start reading before they get any other academic skills. So what we can do, we can talk to them in a shorter phrases. It's very difficult because we are used to delivering our thoughts in a different way, to put a lot of supplementary words or addresses, and these are supplementary words for them. So if you want to deliver a thought, you have to learn how to speak in shorter sentences. People have to understand what you say. And a thing that can help a lot is a plan of excursion, some sort of summaries that you can use. There's something that happened here as well, when a guide was delivering some sort of an information that cannot be shown right now at this particular moment, that does not concern the object that a person is looking at, something that you have to know, and the information that has to be reinforced by some sort of visual information, some kind of visual hints or plans that help to rely not just on hearing, but also on reading and seeing what is narrated about. What concerns about the particularities of information is also the need to cope with a lot of verbal information, some figurative speech, metaphors, Even people who have a very developed speech, they understand it word by word. They have a lack of understanding of what we used to do, some sort of collocations, metaphors, figurative speech. What we can do, we can give some information in advance as a summary. What we can put a line to our excursion, shrink it to a fragment of what we can do and what we want to deliver during that particular excursion, and we have to learn ourselves to deliver just the necessary information. If we know a lot about these objects and we really want to say a lot about this particular picture, this painter, we have to understand that if we want a person with autism to perceive this and to comprehend it, we have to deliver only the necessary information. What you would face also will be the communicative difficulties. That brings a person who is actually leading a tour or organizes a lecture to a discomfort when you're asking a question and no one gives you a response. No one is asking you any questions after what you have delivered. No one is looking you in the eye. And it's very frequently that you think that, okay, people are just uninterested, and it's very hard to understand for a person who loves his profession, who is used to get feedback on what he is or she is saying. But this is just a particularity. What can be changed here? You can avoid some sort of vague memories, or you remember when the Russian composer Tchaikovsky did this and that. Well, they would not remember what you are talking about. They would, you would just really wait for a feedback, and you would be upset, as all people are upset when they don't get a feedback on what they are saying. You can avoid a head-on sort of frontal questions. A question asked to everyone, sometimes a question to no one, so it's very difficult here. And then there are things that we cannot really cope with and we don't really have to cope. And these are the particularities of perception that we have just to deal with. People are listening to you, people are understanding you, but they're in their own way. What else poses a difficulty when we are delivering lectures for people with autism? There's a hypersensitivity towards sounds. It's very hard to be among a lot of people, a lot of noises, a lot of speech, and in order to grab something from that flow that you need to understand, it's very difficult. People are frequently afraid of rough sounds. When your museum has a rough sounds, we face different types of museums, you have to warn people ahead. People get very tired from noisy rooms. Then you see a lot of people in headphones. That headphones allow to cancel all the surrounding noises, but people are listening to you. So you should not really think, shouldn't seem to you that people are not listening to you, because in headphones people see you pretty much well. So people with ASD, they can concentrate on what are you saying, but not on the surrounding noises. The density of people has to be smaller. I'm not saying that you should really limit them and not come with when you have a lot of people in the museum, but when you can choose a time with a smaller density of people, that will be much easier for people with autism to listen. And we always warn about rough or high sounds because they can impede the understanding by people with autism. There is also an individual, we can talk about individual particularities that you cannot really consider beforehand. This can be a threatening stimulus that in the experience of a child had a connection with some situation that happened, some disturbing situation that happened in his past. So you have an accompanying person that knows how to deal with, and your mission is just to calm yourself down. Because these things, they occur all the time. You can tell a story about a bug or about a beetle, and it becomes like a key word, and after that you have an outbreak that you cannot really deal with. Or there are other things. You can invite people on an excursion, and this excursion will correspond to an interest of one of the participants, and that would also can put you down because it's a specific area of interest. The person knows more about these than you because he remembers orthographically all these areas. We have managed to come to the zone of interest. He will ask you plenty of questions. He will draw a lot of attention and would not give you an opportunity to deliver what you want, to narrate further. Which is that you have to just know it. You won't be able to consider it beforehand, but there are specific zones of interest that are sometimes accompanied, very frequently accompanied by people with autism, for instance, dinosaurs, trains, planets, these things that always in the group you will have someone who would deal with it, sometimes even more than you. Overall sensory overload, it does not have to do with the ambience that you will be creating, but you would just face with a lot of stimulus in the museums, and there's always plenty of them, a lot of things of the visual nature, a lot of people, the need for a direct contact, a need to stand and to listen to you, somehow look towards you, stand with other people, not alone, and there's a large speech flow. These are the things that overload in a sensory way quite rapidly. So a zone of reload or relaxation would be great. So they have an opportunity to go there or spend some time there. So you see that the perception of information is much less in time than you got used to it, and the visual accent or the focus should be made on the most important things, so that the child has not to distinguish between different pictures in the whole exhibition that you're talking about. What we face here and what threatens people more, what scares them more, is the different ways of behavioral particularities. You cannot really avoid that overall because going to a museum is some sort of a habit, some sort of a social skill that you're equipped with. And you have to understand that these expressions are being dealt with at schools. If they are there, it means that at this moment nothing can be done with it. So always there is an accompanying person who can help you to deal with it. So what we have here, always a difficulty of comprehending in new places. If someone taught us to be quiet in a museum, then we'll be quiet in all the museums, and the same would apply for the church, same would apply to a theater, so people would comprehend this information overall. So people with autism it's very hard to deal with it. They have to have a certain experience. It is in this place you have to be quiet, and this place to be heard, and that place also you have to be quiet. And this is some sort of a timely difficulty with comprehending of social norms, that it is like that. We have adults with Asperger's syndrome who say, okay, we know that things are here like this, but we have to understand why things are here. Sometimes people who are accepted in our world are not too logical for people. What can help here? Some sort of visual rules or social history can be helpful. When we are going to that place, in this place, it's habitual to do this and that. This will happen first, that will happen next. If you would face some difficulties, you can do this. An accompanying person with a person with autism knows these things and can prepare him or herself. But if you can provide a specific information will happen during your excursion, then we can much better equip our kids for visiting your museum. We will draw it in the pictures and they will be prepared to what will come. Or what they should expect. This is one of my tutors who has certain rules for a child for whom it is hard to stick to these rules, and at this point he came to the museum so that a child can orientate himself, so what will happen can be visualized, and some sort of visual rules and some sort of social history that is developed, that we are going to a museum tomorrow, what will happen there, for how long, and what can be done if you feel hard enough there. Very hard there. What we always want to achieve, that after visiting museums something would stick, something will remain in your soul, in your head, in your perception. What can be done in order to bring a maximum benefit to people with autism, so that they not just gain social skills in the museum, but also get some information? We can ask them brief questions in the end. We can suggest that they should write down something or glue something or mark something with signs, the information that they acquire, or with some you can wrap up with some kind of practical work, an experiment, or molding of that amphora that you were telling them about, or painting a picture similar to what you were telling them about, or some kind of a home assignment with, say, molding or experiment that will help to for them to re-understand the information at home. Here, in the Garage Museum, after one of the excursions, our kids were doing some sort of a work, and that was very beneficial, that was very practical, because we could have discussed it before and to fix it after that, the information that they acquired here. What I would like to say more, the goals for the museums can be various. It's clear that everyone would like the people to know much more, to gain a lot of information, but we should understand that some people who will be coming to the museum will come there to get different skills, the skills of socialization, socializing, behavioral skills, to understand how to behave themselves in front of the others, to listen. They probably might not acquire what are you talking about and the subject that you're talking about, but they have a different mission in attending the museum. There were children who will come and will be able to gain certain senses, emotions and information, but some will have a different goal. But coming to museums, it's a habit. In the same way, we try to form a habit to visit the theatre with small children, a high level of repetition, so you would learn, you would teach yourself and learn how to acquire new knowledge, how to listen and how to see. That's probably all what I wanted to tell you. I really think that socializing through museums and the social environment is the best way of inclusion, the best way of socializing, because statistics, unfortunately, is not very encouraging. Because people in society are not used to, so far, that there are many people around them with autism. We are scared and afraid of something that we cannot really deal with, and the more positive experience with surrounding people who are coming to the museums would have, well, facing people with autism, the easier it would be for them to adapt, and for the people with autism to adapt to society, to the people who are different in their perception, their requirements. But if we do not create special environment, then attending museums and this cultural places by people with autism would be destructive and would bring just a negative experience. I would not give anything to people around. So that's why, if it helped for you with something, I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much for your speech and these astonishingly frank moment that there are different goals of attending museums. There's socialization and acquiring experience. So my first question is, when you manage to penetrate the zone of interest for a person with autism, when it comes to the classes, it's clear. But when it comes to a museum, you mean when a person comes to the sphere of interest and a person starts behaving in that manner? Well, normally an accompanying person knows how to switch a person. He has certain rules that now you have to be quiet. This time you can ask a question. What is important for the person with autism is that you're not just restricting them from asking a question, but to understand when he will manage to ask this question and when he will be able to speak to you. This rule is formed in a very easy manner. So when you acknowledge it verbally with your words, unfortunately, it doesn't really stick. People hear it and then they forget it. So you have to repeat it all the time. So he will be asking when I can ask, when I can ask, when I can ask. But if you draw it, or you write it, or you mark it on a note with a marker, the other side of it, well, after that you ask 3 questions. That's it. So he has a certain rule, like a traffic rule, like rules of visiting some place. This is a rule that should be observed. And the second question: do you have in your work experience when a child had a transition between, the state, I don't like it and I don't want to go to a museum, why are we doing it, to the situation where he says, I want it? Yeah, well, a lot of time it's obvious to see this with Asperger syndrome children, with hyperactivity children. When we are mounting a bike, it's a work. When we learn to read, it's a work. Most of us gain pleasure from reading. It's a kind of a habit at the same time to gain pleasure. Even for lower functioning people, that would transfer itself on the sensory level to the zone of their interest. It's interesting to see, interesting to touch. Some sort of sounds are very interesting, but interesting. This is a habit. All the difficulties would come off, and what is useful will remain. Thank you very much for this great presentation. I have a question about the visual reinforcement. Not always you are able to reinforce something visually. For instance, in a room where excursion takes place, it's dark. So the visual reinforcement is not quite probable. How a mechanism of imagination works. Can we rely on imagination, adult or a child, in case of an adult or a child? This is the main issue. For the person with autism who have a developed imagination, unfortunately, it can drag them away, bear them away from the information that you are trying to deliver. They would grab on the pieces that you were gaining, and then, having a very developed imagination, they would start imagining and will go further to their imagination. If you cannot give visual information straight away, something that comes to one's mind straight away, you can do it beforehand. Before that, give a visual information that reinforces something that you're going to deliver. Talk about maybe some sort of colors that you see in darkness, that shine in darkness, but your speech has to become very short, very informative, something that can be relied on. We have 1 minute for the last question. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me.